Okay, so I'll start us off. So welcome to the CPAN monthly workshop. We've been going for about two and a half years now, doing these monthly workshops where we get together and try to discuss some work that's recently published in some way in the sphere of critical political economy. And we're very pleased that you could join us, Tom, to introduce your book, and Andrea to help us in the discussion. So the discussion will be by Andrea first and then me second. Just a brief introduction maybe. So Tom Haines-Doran is a political economist specializing in transport systems, infrastructure and social movements. He currently works at the University of Leeds, leading research on transport, decarbonisation, and he previously worked as a researcher for the Urban Transport Group, authoring research documents for high-level decision makers in local and national government. And Andrea Brock is a lecturer in international relations at the School of Global Studies, University of Sussex, and I am associate professor at the Department of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Birmingham, and also the convener of the research network who's hosting this, which is the Critical Political Economy Research Network, CPAN, which is Research Network 6 of the European Sociological Association. Okay, so thanks very much. Thanks for agreeing to come and speak to us. And Tom, I'll leave it up to you to start with your overview of the book. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder, could I share my screen? Is that, I think it needs to be enabled. I've just tried.
There you go.
Try again, yeah. Okay then, and you can see that all right if I do this? All good.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
Thanks for having me, and great to be back working with some CPAN people who I've met before at various conferences, and really appreciate the work that you do. Yeah, here to talk about my book that was published earlier this year. This is based on my PhD research, and I mean, basically what happened was that I was at SOAS. I live in Manchester. SOAS is in London. And I kept going to London for various things. Now, I was at a conference, I was presenting about the economics of railways. And on the way back, my train was delayed. And as a result of the delay, I ended up speaking to some passengers who found out that I was doing PhD research on the railways. And they asked me some sort of basic questions. It was quite a long conversation about why the railways were in the mess that they were. And I realized that some of the stuff I was focusing on in my PhD wasn't really addressing these questions full on. So that's why I wanted to write a book. And these are representative photos of those passengers. I didn't actually take photos of them. And the questions were around a couple of things I'll mention here. There are a couple more questions that I won't have time to go into, but they are in the book. And I'll get to them in a second. It's first of all, good idea to know a little bit about the history of the railways in Britain. Obviously, they came about during, or they perpetrated the Industrial Revolution, started to be built in the 19th century. In Britain, it was private development that built the railways. And there was a huge boom in railway construction as they started to become huge sources for speculative investment. And that was followed by a crash where it was turned out that a lot of the railways that were built weren't profitable. And an amalgamation into what became four private companies by the time of the Second World War. And like in much of Europe, the Second World War destroyed much of the railways. And while they hadn't been particularly profitable before the Second World War, there was no way private companies were going to find the cash or have the appetite to invest in a completely broken network. And so the railways were nationalised under the company called British Railways. And there were some strange decisions made, which differed to other European countries. The principal one was that British Railways was supposed to make a profit. It never managed to do so. It was created in 1945. And survived until privatization in the 1990s. And they tried different ways of making it make profit, loads of investment, loads of cuts, and neither of them worked. And it was gradually accepted by the 1990s that railways were reliant on some kind of level of subsidy, not a huge amount of money. Despite that, the then Conservative government decided to press ahead with privatisation to try and really completely separate the railways from the state and the financial responsibility from the state. And so that's what they did. So the first question was, why are the trains always late? It's first probably worth saying that the trains aren't always late, but they are more late than they should be. So this chart is showing the percentage of trains arriving on time and how it's changed since the 1990s when the railways were privatised. So you can see there that the punctuality was about 90%. And in the latest statistics that I found for my book, it was actually higher, but that was because of the COVID crisis. And that tells us something about why trains are late, because it's about capacity utilisation. During the COVID crisis, very few trains ran. And so the trains that did run were mostly on time. So the principal reason why trains are delayed is that it's not enough capacity for all the services that are run, and those services are run because demand is high. And so what happened at privatisation is they took this state-owned company, split it off in the industry into different sections. And the way they did that was to separate the running of the services from the infrastructure management and ownership. And that infrastructure management and ownership was to be undertaken by one private company called Railtrack, which was supposed to be incentivized to do well in terms of the infrastructure through shareholder pressure. But what really happened was that instead of investing in the infrastructure, they tended to give the money to the shareholders instead, which looked great in terms of the share price, but wasn't doing much for the infrastructure. And then in the year 2000, there was a big crash at Hatfield, in a place called Hatfield in Hertfordshire. An intercity train came off the rails, lots of people died. It was found that there was a crack in the track, and one of the reasons for there being a crack was that Railtrack weren't actually inspecting the track properly. And the crash revealed that actually there were probably a lot of cracks around the network, and there was no way that Railtrack was going to find the money to pay for all of the damage caused by its own failure to maintain the infrastructure. And so by this point, there had been a change in government. This was Tony Blair's new Labour government, which really faced a choice about what to do. There's no way they could leave things as they were. The railway system wouldn't operate, that they had to impose 20-mile-an-hour speed restrictions, for example. So they could renationalise the infrastructure, but they chose not to do that. Instead, they brought in a new type of private company called Network Rail. And the purpose of Network Rail was to raise huge amounts of money from international finance, and to do that off the government's balance sheet, and to invest in the infrastructure that way. So here's the timeline showing where Network Rail takes over. And there's two lines here. One's the spending on infrastructure, the other's the amount of passengers using the network. Lots more passengers using the network every year until COVID, for lots of different reasons, not necessarily because of privatization, but changes in working patterns, the expansion of the higher education sector, and industries closing down, meaning that people had to commute more and that kind of thing. So this private financing solution, if you like, was quite successful in some respects. As you can see, the spending on infrastructure started to match the actual increase in demand for services. But this could only last so long, because basically the borrowing undertaken was in lieu of public subsidy. So the company was borrowing more and more money from international financial markets, but not having any means to repay that. And so effectively it started borrowing money to pay off its previous debts and just accumulating more and more debt. And as long as this was off the government's balance sheet, the governments didn't mind. And by 2014, it was a coalition government, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats under David Cameron. They were faced with a problem when the European Union in 2014 changed its accounting rules and said that this debt that had been accumulated was actually government borrowing, not private sector debt. And you'll recall the whole thing around that time was austerity. So this government that was cutting everything left, right and centre had £34 billion of debt shoved onto its balance sheet by the European Union. To put that in some perspective, that's around half of the financial black hole that brought down the Liz Truss government, although that's not necessarily nowhere near as it was hardly even commented on at the time, but is half of that deficit. The result then has been that Network Rail has got these massive debts and it can't borrow money off international finance to repay them. Therefore, government subsidy has had to go up massively, and the result has been a decline in investment in infrastructure despite increasing demand for services towards the late 2000s. And that had a bad effect on punctuality, as you can see from this chart. It was heading down towards 85% of trains on time before COVID hit. And what's the effect been on the finances? Well, this is all real terms, so I've adjusted this for inflation, but you can see how government subsidy fluctuated between about £2 and £5 billion a year for the railways up until the 1990s. That increased a bit after Hatfield in 2000, and then decreased as Network Rail took more and more private finance on. But that renationalisation of Network Rail in 2014 suddenly put these borrowing costs onto the government balance sheet and doubled the public subsidy of the railways. And so before COVID, you were looking at an annual subsidy of about £14 billion, which is about 5 times the amount that was required before the railways were privatised. And this is obviously partly one of the reasons why tickets are so expensive. Just to give an example, I don't know how many people here live in Germany, but the most you'll pay from Hanover to Berlin in pounds is 115 return, but the walk-up fare from Manchester to London, for example, is an astonishing £369.40. And loads of studies have shown that the fares in Britain are the most expensive in Europe in most ways. So a lot of the extra costs attributed to the railways as a result of privatisation, that money that's gone to private finance has come not only from taxpayers but from passengers too. And the reason for that is there was this decision was made in the year 2000 after Hatfield. Where are we going to get this money from? Okay, we're going to do this PFI type private finance thing with the infrastructure, but also we're going to have to start putting fares up. A lot of the fares are regulated by government, so they effectively set how much money passengers are paying. The decision made by Tony Blair's government was to shift the balance of payments from the tax proportionally from the taxpayer to the passenger. So passengers used to pay around a third of the costs of running the railways, and then the aim was to move that to 2/3 of the cost. So there was a deliberate attempt to increase fares income from passengers. And that's what happened. So by 2020, there'd been a 40% increase in fares in real terms since privatisation. But there were other decisions made around that time too, which were just as important. So in 1992 at Rio, there was a world summit on climate change. The scientists were saying to politicians, you have to do something about this. This is a massive problem. It's going to affect everyone and it's going to disrupt the world economy. And initially, politicians took this fairly seriously, and even the Conservative government in Britain did. And it looked at the carbon accounting numbers for the economy in Britain and said, well, if you look at it, actually, one of the biggest problems we have is private motor vehicle use. And so therefore, we have to put up the tax on consumption of petrol and diesel. Ring fence that money and then spend that money on alternatives like public transport. And that's what they did. And just like many of the policies that they inherited from the previous government, Tony Blair's government stuck with that policy too. And there'd been, by 2000, a 40% increase in fuel duty. But then there were large-scale protests about this. There'd also been a rise in the oil price. And the owners of road haulage firms, big farmers, got together and started blockading ports where fuel was coming into the country, causing very significant disruption to the economy. I won't have time to talk about the strikes on the railways that we've seen recently, but it's a good lesson in how to change government policy. If you cause enough damage to the economy, the government can change. And actually, Tony Blair's government tried to hold out for quite a long time, but it really was his greatest crisis until the Iraq War, this fuel protest, and the policy was scrapped. So they scrapped fuel duty. They even scrapped the ring fence on fuel duty going to public transport. And since then, we've had successive governments that have introduced having no fuel duty rise whatsoever, despite inflation. So in real terms, which is the graph you can see here, fuel duty has been cut every year by every government. And I see the Labour Party's announced recently that it's going to do the same after the next election, around a 30% decrease in fuel duty since 2000. And it's been estimated that if that hadn't happened, if they'd even kept it at the rates that were there in 2000, the amount of money that would be raised each year would be more than the income from passengers for the railways and the bus industry. In other words, that you could have used that money to make trains and buses free to use. So those are the decisions that have been made. Like I say, I can talk about the strikes in the discussion, but yeah, it's probably a good idea to get the discussants involved. And I'm going to, at the end, I'll leave you my contact details if anybody wants a signed copy of the book, which I can send in the post.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom. That was a great summary. Andrea, I think, are you going to go first in the response?
Yes, thank you so much. Can you hear me right now? Sorry,
Yeah.
I have some issue. Yeah, okay, great.
No problem.
Great, thank you so much for the book and also the presentation now. I loved reading the book. It's already said just before. I learned so much, but also I just loved how accessible, empirically rich, clear, fascinating the book was. It was not like an academic book at all. I just enjoyed reading it so much. And it did answer so many of the questions that I pose myself all the time when I'm stuck on a train between Brighton and London or elsewhere. So yeah, thank you so much for that, for the invite to speak here and the book. There were some parts of the kind of story of the book that were less surprising for me. You know, yes, privatization makes things worse, often more expensive, etc. but there were also parts of the story that were much more surprising. So it wasn't just the Tories screwing things up as usual. It was the story so much more complex than just, you know, privatization was bad, nationalization is the answer. So I learned a lot about kind of the way, yeah, the government interference is so important to kind of understand much more than I think most people realize. Including, for instance, that kind of anecdote around the rejection of the government to allow for postponing the publication of the timetable change in 2018. That was quite an eye-opener to me. That's really, really interesting. And I thought your political economy analysis showed really well some of these structural drivers, you know, some of the kind of kind of laying bare was wrong, some of the justifications, excuses that are made by railway companies, for instance, around, you know, staff off sick, etc., and the political dimensions of that, and particularly kind of the kind of complex competing interests of actions of capital, but also the power of these ideologies of competitiveness, precarity, austerity that are kind of underlying what's been happening to Britain's railways. And so my comments are they're not at all kind of critiques of the book. They're just kind of thoughts to kind of put maybe in conversation with put the book in conversation with other debates and questions involving railways, and my own work, which is on high-speed rail and HS2 in particular. And so maybe I'll start with that, because for me that was a little bit the elephant in the room in the book. Where's high-speed rail in your story of railways? And of course you touch on it really briefly towards the end in, I think, quite a critical way. Like you, of course, it's very clearly clear that you don't just, you know, propose high-speed railway development as the answer to everything. But I do think we need to look a little bit more at high-speed rail to kind of particularly answer that question that you posed at the end, like what are railways for in the 21st century, right? Because I think railway development, high-speed railway development, really give you an answer to kind of what the government thinks they're for or should be for, right? So in my own work, I look at HS2 in particular as what I call a green extractivist mega project. And I think that looking at HS2 teaches us that, well, firstly, rail transport, railways, you know, they're not a uniformly good thing, which I know you don't pose, but that's of course often the kind of dominant position in particularly kind of, you know, ecologically conscious or environmentalist circles. But it really matters who owns and who controls railways, right? In relation to HS2 in particular, we know that most of the proposed benefits of HS2 will accrue to London. There's great work by the New Economics Foundations on that. They're expected to, rather than improve, to deepen existing regional inequalities between areas in Britain, all under the name of leveling up. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So according to its own, or based on HS2's own figures, the HS2 demand model forecasts that most of the average passenger on HS2 will be in the top 10% of income distribution. So essentially rich commuters. And I think to understand really kind of why the government is pushing this so much, and therewith to kind of maybe add to your excellent analysis of British railways more generally, we need to look at kind of Britain's industrial strategy that underpins and that informs the assumptions under kind of what type of railway the UK government is investing in. So Britain's industrial strategy is primarily occupied with labor productivity, the ratio between gross value added to employment, so how much a job contributes to economic growth. And this focus on productivity projects London as a role model and translates into this national leveling up agenda, right? So the idea underlying HS2 and the levelling up agenda in particular is to make the quote unquote unproductive north more like London, right? And reduced travel times are key to this increase in productivity, because as you say in the book as well, travel time is generally kind of considered to be wasted time, right? And this focus on productivity, I think, comes from this so-called British productivity puzzle, the long-term ongoing decline in labor productivity growth in Britain. And the 2017 new National Industrial Strategy heavily emphasizes productivity as its kind of unifying theme. And London in this kind of whole, well, and so strategy becomes the reference point for economic performance and high labor productivity. And too many cities in Britain are argued to underperform, right? Whereas London is this kind of world-leading hub, a magnet for international business and talent. And that's also re-emphasized in the 2022 Levelling Up strategy, which positions London as this productivity leader and suggests that other cities and regions need to emulate its policies, right? And the government, of course, explains this with this positive agglomeration effects, economies of scale, essentially, you know, accumulation of physical, human, financial, and social capitals. But Dan Coffey and colleagues in their really fantastic analysis have shown that really this productivity is just, you know, the product of exploitation, right? The product of a service-based and city economy that thrives on low wages, high rents, and high house prices, right? Long commutes in London, etc. So I think this emphasis on productivity for growth, linked to this, the idea that travel times is wasted time, is really important to keep in mind when we look at what the government thinks, what is the railway for these days, right? So it's HS2 is a completely government-driven and controlled project, of course, profiting particularly the construction industry in rich communities. But I think that emphasis on growth and competitiveness in, you know, kind of this long-term industrial decline is really important as a kind of add-on to your analysis and a partial answer of what what railways are for, according to the government, and also there is what we are up against, maybe as we demand and kind of maybe struggle for a different type of railway system, right? And linked to that question that you posed, I do wonder whether it's also worth looking at in order to say what railways are for today, and that's not to say that never changes, but to look at the historical use and kind of origins and political economy of railways in slightly more depth, right? Of course, I think railway development is closely entangled with colonialism, extractivism. You know, driver was transporting coal and goods that were extracted through colonialism and slavery. And of course, in the colonies, the development of railways often led to deindustrialization, exploitation, and extraction while benefiting Imperial Britain, right? So I wonder whether it's worth kind of looking a little bit about into this history to kind of understand why we ended up where we ended up in this very different project. I also wanted to kind of really quickly go a little bit into the ecological dimensions of the book, which of course of railways more generally, which you kind of touch on, but I want to kind of, I had some thoughts I maybe wanted to share in relation to that. So you say yourself that electrified railways and e-mobility generally isn't like the solution to climate catastrophe, of course, and you can't just replace existing technologies with electrified versions of the same thing. And just like that's true for cars, e-mobility, electric cars, that's of course also, I would argue, true for railways, and particularly electrified high-speed railways, right? They're not a simple solution to climate catastrophe, but also transport poverty and transport injustices, etc. So, and that's maybe kind of one of the few points where I maybe disagree a little bit. Like, I think I always have to, my alarm bells always ring when I read about zero carbon travel. I don't really think zero carbon travel, except for walking, is possible as such. I think that's a myth in itself. And I think that even electrified rail transports emits carbon and requires the extraction of resources and the use of energy, of course, right? And even when that energy, the electricity, is lower carbon, so-called renewable electricity, that is never truly sustainable at that scale, and certainly not zero carbon. It requires land extraction, emits carbon, whether that's for steel, for wind power, or the extraction of rare earth minerals for solar, etc. Not just for the expansion of rail lines, which you yourself state is not like the solution at all because of these embedded carbon emissions, but also, you know, just for the operation of trains, of course, for the transport of people and goods, for the replacement of stock, for all associated infrastructures, etc. So at the end of the day, even railways, they are technology that has an ecological and social impact. And of course, like all technologies, is shaped by the social conditions under which it operates, right? Which you, of course, show very well: the profit maximization, privatization, the drive to destroy unions, etc. So I would push even further, kind of on you mentioned this, of course, saying that rail expansion or even electrification of railways and investment into railways must go hand in hand with a much more drastic reduction in overall travel, the encouragement of slow travel, drastic reduction of commuting for work, so expansion of home working, and working time generally, you know, 4-day weeks, 3-day weeks, etc., and rethinking the idea of work and mobility linked to work. I really liked your idea around the kind of free-to-use community workspace hubs, but I think those are all just kind of smaller elements of a kind of, you know, bigger kind of drive for radical reduction in travel and radical reduction in growth, or degrowth rather, right? A degrowth in the transport of goods and humans, a drive for localization, but also, you know, a challenge of kind of consumerism, animal agriculture, transport of animals, for instance, etc. And that brings me to my last point on the demands. I really like that the demands you put forward, the reduction in travel through home working, this idea of community work space hubs. You also demand or can suggest banning domestic aviation, reducing international aviation, shifting car use to rail, and you engage with this idea of the National Climate Service, free bike and bus use, investment into cycling infrastructure, and then of course the electrification, expansion of new railway lines. Although, as I said, you seem quite, yeah, I think you don't just kind of push for expansion there. You're aware of the embodied emissions, the need for concrete and steel, etc. You also call for the abolition of first class, which is interesting. The New Internationalist in a recent edition actually demanded the abolition of second class, stating all passengers deserve first class treatment. But I guess you can have a discussion around like the use of space and demand, etc. there. But yeah, and then you demand or you call for fares being half price of car travel, paid by wealth taxes in combination with free local public transport and the expansion of night trains, all of which I think are really reasonable and brilliant demands. And I think we can probably go even a little bit further in with these demands in challenging the contemporary political economy of railways, calling for not just a nationalized, but a grassroots or collectively rather owned and controlled railway system, if beyond nationalized, right? Cooperatively owned and organized according to needs, not profits, with all income reinvested in services and infrastructure. Because I think the idea of public ownership, with why it's a kind of easy kind of leftist kind of demand and slogan is, I mean, the NHS kind of shows that that doesn't necessarily mean that that kind of ownership is outside of the kind of driver of managerialism and extraction, exploitation that private ownership kind of is based on. So I would go beyond the kind of demand for nationalization, with but really kind of think a bit more about kind of what are maybe models we can use to really radically democratize and collectively own and control railway systems from below. And then another point I think is worth emphasizing a bit more is the kind of the need for fuller integration into European and international railway systems. So in the last few years, I have spent so many days and nights on trains traveling from Brighton to Greece, to Norway, to Spain, to Romania. And my main issue has always been, it's never getting from A to B, it's getting stranded in between because these different systems are not integrated, right? You end up with the last train in Barcelona, and the Barcelona train that goes on is, they won't accept my ticket because I'm delayed because of, you know, French trains, etc. So I think much more needs to be done to kind of connect with, you know, consumer groups and I don't like the word consumer, with people who are organizing and campaigning for railways in different European countries and pushing for policy kind of collectively. And the other thing that always frustrates me a lot is the lack of accessibility for cyclists. That is another kind of key barrier, in my view, for long distance railway use. So I think we need fully accessible stations for cyclists, and of course accessible generally. I think you talk about that a lot, so I didn't really go into that. Like the fact that so many stations are still not wheelchair accessible, for instance, is just outrageous, really. Free bicycle transport on all trains and much cheaper fares. But I think what the kind of takeaway point, and I'll finish this is really that all of these demands, they're not techno fixes, that a lot of them are social fixes, right? So that kind of address issues in this kind of wider economy that strives for growth, but should be kind of, you know, focusing on things like degrowth, facilitating a different way of living and working from home, tackling automobility not just as a form of transport, so you talk about the modal shifts, of course, but as an ideology also, right? An ideology and a system that underpins the design of cities and rural spaces and everything else, which requires us to kind of reclaim public space from car use, like turning spaces for cars into space for humans and non-humans, for city gardens, for bike lanes, regrowing kind of what currently kind of parking lots and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So it's not just about stopping road building projects, stopping kind of destructive projects, but also the removal of concrete. This is one of those things that never happens, right? It's like even when new roads are developed, we never kind of actually undo or remove the kind of system of automobility. And another point I think that's really closely linked to this is issue of land access and land injustice, right? So we currently have access to just between 7 and 8% of Britain's countryside and 3% of Britain's rivers, which forces people to take really long journeys to access nature, right? Again, contributing to the demand for travel. This is something I think that's crucial to reduce the need for mobility by recommoning and facilitating access to nature and spaces around us. And of course, that's tied in with like private land ownership and access and all of that. And the same is true in cities, right? Urban decommunification and deprivatization would massively help reduce the need for transport. And lastly, I really like how you kind of close with exploring ideas of solidarity and campaigning as the solutions, as opposed to kind of individualized, you know, drive for compensation, for instance, that you criticize. And I think the kind of current climate of strike maybe provides a really good opportunity for that. So solidarity, not just between passengers and rail workers, but of course, you know, union between unions, but also workers across borders, and not just seeing humans as, you know, consumers, but like as active participants, and hopefully people can help reshape and redesign our transport systems for a more sustainable future. In Germany, there's kind of mass environmental justice group support for the rail strikes in the last couple of years, which I thought was really interesting. Just as kind of environmental activists kind of really pushing for, I guess, the kind of, the the kind of equivalent of the energy transition, the Energiewende, which is the Verkehrswende, the traffic transition or mobility transition, pushing for mobility justice beyond kind of technological solutions. So yeah, I really like your kind of call for solidarity and collective organizing at the end there. And yeah, I'll close there. I hope these thoughts are maybe a little bit interesting. And thanks so much again for writing the book and inviting me to comment on it.
Excellent. Thanks, Andrea. That's really interesting to hear your thoughts on that. I've got some comments as well. The people that are listening in, if you have any questions that you want to discuss, then feel free to type them in the chat as well. And we'll leave some time to respond to those if you have them. Yeah, so I mean, I think in terms of the appreciation of the book, I definitely echo Andrea's comments. I mean, I really liked the style of engagement, the way that you managed to do what, I mean, a lot of people talk about trying to do, but never actually really achieve it, which is the kind of bridging of the approaches and critiques that we develop in social science with a kind of style of writing that can actually speak to people who aren't fully embedded within the university system. So I thought that was really excellent, the way you could sort of tease out some of the kind of critiques of key trends of neoliberalism around finance, how that links to the provision of public services and the problems that it creates. All of that was just explained so nicely in a sort of straightforward manner and in a convincing manner as well. Which I thought was really excellent, and what basically we should be doing more of. And so it was really welcome to see that you'd done that, and then to do that with that kind of combination of really rich empirical discussion of how, in fact, the railways have developed over pretty much the last 150 years, is it the span roughly, maybe 200. Just to see that in rich detail. I mean, I didn't really know anything about the railway industry until I read the book, so I felt once I'd read it, I'd really absorbed a huge amount, which in an easy way, because the way you spell it out so nicely and neatly. So yeah, I thought I really appreciated that. I really also just the narrative style of starting off with that with the story of the encounter on the train was really nice way of bringing the whole thing to life. And the structure of the chapters around these 5 basic kind of simple questions that anybody would ask if they were stuck in that kind of situation was just also really nice, like hooks for the structure of the whole thing. So yeah, I really liked it basically. And then I've really just got, I've got one more additional point about what I liked about it, and then I've got a series of probably just questions. So the second kind of that's the more general stuff. In terms of sort of, I suppose, analytical focus, I liked the way that you could combine this discussion of how the rail industry has been affected by this kind of neoliberal transformation, but also at the same time how that had been butting up against different forms of resistance, and how that the interaction between that resistance and attempts at neoliberal transformation, how they're kind of combined at the same time, was really what I think we should be doing again. So I was really glad to see that you did that. I suppose, I mean, it works not only, and I think I'm not quite sure, but I think you were saying it's not necessarily progressive, because the fuel tax protests were one of the key factors that prompted, obviously, the increase in or the increase in subsidy for cars and the reduction in opportunities, in relative terms at least, for supporting the rail industry. So I did wonder, I guess, whether that's, I mean, in some senses we might say that's an attempt at avoiding regressive taxation, but also the way that it was paid for was through a lack of relative support for the rail industry. So it was interesting to see that. But then also when you got more into detail of the different forms of agency that you described regarding the responses to things like station and line closures. So it was really notable when you pointed out the Settle to Carlisle line campaign victory, which, the way you described it, essentially kind of put a ceiling on the level of reductions that could go ahead. And so to see that that was one of the kind of key boundaries that was set by a key campaign was a really nice way of illustrating, I thought, well, illustrating and also showing that that's what's happened in terms of how the restructure of the rail industry could occur. And then I hadn't heard of the South Yorkshire Freedom Riders either, so to hear about that kind of campaign, which is obviously kind of nice resurrection of some of the civil rights movements style or sloganeering or label, at least, to try to use that as a way to ensure that elderly and disabled people could get access to train. It was really just nicely vivid and way of showing the role of political agency in having an impact on the scope for restructuring. So yeah, I really liked all of that. Then I've got a few questions which maybe you will and maybe you won't have time to answer, but just things that I was interested in. So the fare hike, I got a bit confused about why I couldn't really see what was driving the fare hike, because you said the fares are still regulated, at least partially, and it seemed like you were saying it's because they chose RPI as they chose CPI as the measure. Wait there, which one did they choose? They chose RPI or CPI as the measure. I couldn't remember actually which one it was, and I got a bit confused about that, because when I looked at anti-austerity stuff, it was the switch from RPI to CPI, which was criticised, because that basically meant that you would only reduce wages and perhaps benefits according to CPI, which is lower than RPI. And so I think you were saying, that's it. So no, I don't know. So the fares were linked to RPI, and you were saying that was the wrong one because they should have chosen CPI, which would have kept fares lower. So I just thought it was interesting that the government chooses the one that's most beneficial, because they chose CPI for wages and RPI for fares. And in both instances, we would argue that was the wrong choice. So I wonder if really the point is just it's kind of neither are really correct, probably. I was interested in your point about the RMT. I mean, I've just published this study looking at worker protest in the UK during the 2010s, and basically the RMT were pretty much one of the most successful of the mainstream trade union or the TUC trade unions throughout the 2010s. So I agreed with your point that they had managed to prevent largely especially the move to, or at least reach an agreement around the move to cardless trains. But you also seem to say that post-pandemic they're going to be less powerful, and I started to think that the whole kind of Mick Lynch phenomenon seemed to suggest that RMT were still, unless they just haven't realised that their structural power has been diminished, and that's about to be found out. So I was interested in whether the RMT is kind of weakened in that sense that you perhaps suggested. And then I think just on perhaps in terms of like skepticism, the final chapter, I wondered if it was more hopeful than we can afford to be, because the argument seems to be that what we need is a combination of passenger campaigns, workers as if playing a supportive role in terms of trade union activity, and then some kind of friendly political force, probably a government that's friendly towards the idea of some form of a just transition. And that really is the only real coalition that we can imagine that would actually put in place the necessary measures in terms of a just transition, infrastructure investment and so on, that would allow the transition to occur in a just way. So I mean, obviously that would be a good outcome, but I did start to think that the point that you made, especially around the importance of car users as a kind of coalition of voters that is, or as a block of voters that is almost impossible to ignore, it seemed to be quite overwhelming in the way that you describe the analysis, especially given the fact that it's going to become a self-reinforcing, because as the rail becomes less invested in and less reliable, obviously car users become more prevalent. And it is difficult, I think, to imagine a government sort of abandoning that commitment to car use. So when you were sort of saying, electric cars aren't the answer and everyone's trying to convince themselves that it can be, I did find it difficult to think that any political authority, any political party or government is going to sort of deny that fact, that it isn't really the answer. So if that would be, I guess, a slightly gloomier reading than the one you present, and I wondered whether I'm right to be gloomy or not, I suppose. I wasn't just these are just tiny, small, brief points. I wondered if you look at punctuality rates since 2021, because that's the most recent one. I wonder if we're going back, if we're going in any direction since then, if we know or not. And then finally, it was a more kind of general point, as your goal as an author obviously was to try to present the work in a accessible way. What I was interested in, what's your sense in terms of, because obviously part of the problem is we struggle sometimes to get people to listen to us. So how have you found the reception to the book in terms of, do you think sort of policymakers or activists or passengers have responded in the way that you've hoped, if you're able to gauge that, obviously? Okay, thanks. There's a lot there. But thanks for the book. It's really great. I enjoyed reading it as well.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious that maybe other people have questions too. And all the comments are completely relevant and really interesting. And I learned a lot just from listening to the comments. So,
shall we just, before you start then, does anybody who's listening in want to indicate now if you do want to ask a question, because we can then time ourselves based on that. Okay, in that case, then maybe we just let you. Okay, James wants to ask a question after this. Okay, we'll aim for 6:30 at the very latest, then, shall we? Or
okay.
Keep that into account. Yeah.
Well, that's great. I'm going to try and be brief anyway. So yeah, thank you, Andrea. And I think a lot of the points that you made were the sort of, and the suggestions that you made with it were sort of the kinds of things that I was hoping that book would do. So I was probably trying not to answer all of these points, but to start a discussion really. And really some of your responses are some of the best I've got on that so far. It's really difficult, isn't it? I mean, I think that what we're talking about with transport is, I mean, the way that it's sort of traditionally been thought about is this predict and provide approach, where the government or private companies can see trends in demand for usage in various different ways, and then seek to provide that, meet some with some kind of provision that would help. You know, more congestion, for example. The demand could be political, I suppose, as well as just in terms of trends of movement. So there's, talking about HS2, for example, there's a lot going on there in terms of, you mentioned imperialism, inter-imperialist rivalry, the amount of infrastructure that's been invested in particularly East Asia, I think is important there. International competitiveness, and that kind of thing. But I suppose what I'm trying to say in the last chapter is that we have to think about the ends first and then go back to the transport, which is basically what you were describing in your suggestions, I think. But it's incredibly difficult to do, and actually, I would argue impossible or illegitimate for any one person to try and, because really, all of the things that you mentioned probably need to happen. How do you go about that? What is the agency involved? And then what are the implications then for transport? There has to be some kind of democratic process which decides this. And that's on the basis of democracy not just being a good thing for moral reasons, but to actually receive inputs from a vast swathe of the population about what's acceptable, what's desirable, and how we're going to do things in limited timescales. And I would probably go as far as to argue that we need more than citizens' assemblies for that kind of thing. So that's the general point, but more specifically, but nevertheless, we have to try, I think, if we're writing a book like this, or the work that you do, to try and give some initial thoughts about what that might be. And there's a lack of discussion in all of these matters, which is horrifying, and which, I guess, as an author, places one in a difficult position, because really what I wanted to do is just to write a critique of what's happened with the railways. But you find yourself in the times that we're living in having to tackle these questions which people writing about this 10 and 15 years ago didn't have to. So it was quite legitimate, I think, to say 20 years ago, let's just build more railways, or let's reopen the railways that closed. I don't think it is anymore. And the difficulty with that is your audience aren't necessarily expecting that. And relating to what David just said, it's not it's not an optimistic thing to say. And this is the problem with, I guess, degrowth. Although I support it, it's the big difficulty, of course, with degrowth is about having a conversation about things that we can't have anymore. Although you would probably rightly say it's about what we could have that we don't have it, and whatever. But anyway, HS2. I agree with what you say. In my book, I say, well, sort of, what about the bit that's already half being built? And I make a case for using carbon accounting in terms of embodied emissions to think about, well, the main argument against HS2, especially from the right, is that there's a fallacy of sunk costs. Ignore the fallacy of sunk costs. So even if you've already spent, I think by this point it's been about £5 billion. It's a fallacy to think, well, we might as well spend the rest of the money, which is probably 100 billion, because it's still better to save the 95 billion. I'm less concerned about the monetary aspects of it and more the environmental and the social. And I think once you've probably built half a railway to Birmingham, I think it will be useful, that bit, once it's built. But, whatever the carbon costs, they're going to have to be taken from somewhere else. This is the problem. So you have to think about all the other things you can't have if you build it. The thing about first class is, I agree, let's make everything first class. Fine. But the problem with the problem I kept coming back to and trying to write this is, we've got maybe less than 10 years. So I could go around ripping out seats and, changing the decor and stuff and calling it the new first class. But fundamentally, let's just stop selling, let's declass. I mean, the guards on the train already do this when it's too busy. And sometimes they do it despite company policy. Just say, just go and sit in there. If there's not enough space, just go and sit in there. The funny thing about it, actually, is if you look at the economic data, the stats, is that it doesn't make any money. So the class consciousness of the government in maintaining first class is really interesting, I think. And it's mostly about not wanting to be around poor people, in my opinion. I won't go into the history of the role of railways in colonialisation, although I take your point, and it is relevant to what happens next, not just of historical interest. And on the this issue of sort of what sort of railway do we want and ownership, I agree with too, and I think you're right to say that I maybe could have gone a bit further in terms of sketching out what a collectively owned and managed system would look like. I think that's fair. I suppose the difficulty of this book is that what I can't see very clearly with the railways, because of the heaviness of the infrastructure and the scale, is how to do little experiments, demonstrations, which you might be able to do with agriculture, for example. I think I'm not really an autonomist, and so maybe it's less of a problem for me, but it's a question I always want to pose to autonomous. What are we going to do with this kind of problem? And it's probably a naive question, and I apologize if there are such people here and they already have great answers to that. But yeah, I mean, we're going to have, there's going to have to be some kind of, if people have been looking at the strikes over the past few months, will probably agree that it's the workers that know what's going on with the railways, certainly not the government or international finance. And oh yeah, so what else was I going to say about that? So, oh yeah, and there have been examples of that happening. The Spanish Civil War, for example, the trade unions took over the railways and ran them. So it's not, it has been done before. Yeah, completely agree about all the stuff about cars. I mean, this speaks to David's point a bit as well. One of the ways that you get fewer people voting for motoring reasons is to have fewer people driving. And also sort of car dependency isn't just about sort of cars being easier and, you know, having a utility. It's the lack of alternatives, and it's where it places people socially when they've got no transport. One of the things that I don't feel has been addressed in academic literature, and that's why I've just written an article about it, I'm submitting it soon, is about car finance. So if you look at the data, there's been an explosion in personal car finance debt amongst the population, and it's been new forms of car finance have come to the fore, which increase financial risk to motorists. And my thesis on that is that one of the ways they've been able to increase personal financial risk from motoring has been car dependency. So they're basically the car companies, because they've basically reached market saturation in the wealthier countries, are pushing more. They're pushing car finance onto people in order to maintain a certain level of production which is needed by the industry. I mean, basically, what we've got in these mature markets is the car industry pushing more and more and bigger cars, SUVs, more expensive cars, onto the streets, at the same time as pushing ever increasing amounts of private finance, debt onto individuals and households, which looks like a bubble, really. If you look at the data, it looks like a big bubble. And then the question is always, is the government going to ride to the rescue and bail out and do a massive bailout like they have done before? And, you know, so I think there are chinks in the armor of the car industry. There are massive chinks in the armor of the car industry, and it's not just from political pressure, it's internal contradictions too. Whether that's enough to change the politics around motorization, I guess we'll have to see. So I just want to move on quickly to David's comments. Yeah, about the fuel protests. I would see there's a couple of authors, I can't remember their first names, but Cox and Nielsen, who've written on social movements and the nature of them from a Gramscian perspective, and they contrast social movements from below, which is what we used to have thinking like protest movements, from social movements from above. And social movements from above are there to sort of maintain the status quo. They're right-wing movements which can co-opt parts of the population, but they're usually the basis is from the more wealthier parts, from small to big size businesses. I would see the fuel protests of the 2000s in that vein. I would see protests against clean air zones, mostly in that vein, and low traffic neighborhoods and that kind of thing. So it's not to say that working class people aren't involved, and some are, but that the basis of organization, the funding, is from basically from capital. So it is a problem for environmentalists, and you know, I would just suggest that the success in that is the way they frame I guess the convenience and the fear of not being able to access basic things in life if people put up the price of your petrol too much, or that kind of thing. It speaks to a lot of our politics at the moment, I think, around climate change. Thank you for referencing the South Yorkshire Freedom Riders. It's a bit amazing to me, actually, that the tactic of fair strikes hasn't been attempted that much, because where I've seen it happen in Britain, and there have been examples in footnotes in my book in Chile, for example, they're enormously successful. They are a very risky tactic in some respects. This is where the agency of the workers and the passengers can be most effective, I think, is collective forms of refusal. So yeah, it's not just about getting a supportive government in, although I come back to this problem of the vastness of the infrastructure. Short of saying at the end of the book, we just need to have some kind of socialist revolution and then sort all this stuff out later, we probably do need some kind of radical reformist government to at least stop passing laws to make strikes more difficult and arresting people for saying that they might walk down the street too slowly, which is the latest thing in Britain, and that kind of thing. There's no alternative there, I think. But there are these really inspiring examples that passengers can take up tomorrow if they get together. And I'd like to facilitate that sort of strategy. The RPI thing, yeah, I actually had some feedback from trade unionists about that part of my book. Basically, what I'm saying is what you said, that they have used for measures of inflation that's convenient to them, so to increase income and that kind of thing. That doesn't mean, though, that trade unionists are incorrect to be pushing for RPI-linked pay increases. I guess my point is that it's different for workers than it is for the government. People on lower incomes tend to experience the effects of inflation more because they're more reliant on basic goods. You know, the government experiences inflation, but in a much different way. And the implications for inflation for the government are different, in the tax that they would seek to collect would have to be from, as I say in the book, from the rich, because you know, we're going to have to pay for this. And even my relatively modest proposals that involve not really expanding the railways that much are going to cost way more money than we're currently putting into the system than currently, which is already ridiculously high because of all the privatization that's happened. And we've tried all the private finance experiments. It's going to have to come from the rich, which makes it obviously hugely political, and we can have our own views about how realistic that is, but that's the only fair thing to say, I think. Yeah, and you wanted to know about punctuality since 2021. That's been really terrible, and that's mostly to do with the labour relations in the industry. So as I say in the book, the industry was designed primarily to cut costs by attacking the workforce and disorganizing the workforce. What's really interesting, you picked up on it, David, I'll finish here, is that is an example of a neoliberal restructuring, which in a very important sense has been very, very unsuccessful. And I think gives us pause for thought, I think, regarding the rest of the terrible situation. You know, the privatization gave opportunities for new forms of union organization. But not only that, there's these qualitative aspects to it, which are massive, which is about the determination of the workforce to, in the case of the northern strikes, the guard strikes here, they were on strike almost every Saturday for nearly 2 years. Those of us that have been involved in the UCU strikes can sympathize. But this is a big part of the picture. Anyway, I shut up now, and I think there's more questions, and let's go from there.
And thank you. James, I think you wanted to go on a question.
Yes, thanks very much. I'm aware that I'm the intruder here in a sense, so apologies for that. I should just say who I am. I am Emeritus Professor of Political Theory at the University of Hull, but I'm also a local rail campaigner trying to reinstate a line from Hull via Beverley to York. And it's in that slightly parochial capacity that I just want to ask this question, because it seemed to be that you were rejecting the idea of reinstatement of lines, although I may be misreading it because I haven't read the book yet. I'm looking forward to reading it. Now, my question to that would simply be, why not reinstate lines appropriately? I mean, one of the big questions there, I suppose, is which areas of the country do you do it in? And what are the requirements that you have to show to display that a reinstated line would make real sense or not? Now, in East Yorkshire, we have a very clear sense that a lot of lines were ripped out during beaching. No one is claiming that they all ought to be replaced. So, you know, the undue beaching brigade makes no sense, really. And not even beaching was wrong on every call. But there are certain areas of the country, East Anglia would be another, and I could mention others, where, you know, what we need to do, it seems to a lot of us, is to acknowledge that, using the title of the book, you know, the railways are broken in various different ways. One of the ways in which they're broken is that they are so Londocentric, everything spoking out from London as a centre, that the east-west connectivity was shattered in all sorts of parts of the country. And that's very clear. It's clear in Cambridge and Oxford, for example. And finally, that is going through. But in a way, you know, the better cases are in places like rural Yorkshire, where a line was taken out and where there's a very good case for reinstating a lateral east-west line, re-establishing connectivity, re-establishing capacity and alternative routes, re-establishing resilience against climate change, because the Humber and the sea around here isn't very friendly in that respect. And also the question of straightforward competitive competition with the roads. I mean, our case here is a straightforward one. Loads of cars, one of the most dangerous roads in the country. Buses, plenty of buses, but of course they get stuck in the traffic. You could do it in half the time by rail. And also I'm speaking also as an environmental campaigner. I'm very alert to the environmental points here. You know, I'm much more in favor of local reinstatement than I am of building big projects like HS2, although I don't necessarily discount all of the arguments in favor of HS2, because again, some of those are about shifting capacity and opening up possibilities elsewhere. That, of course, is not how it's going to look right now. But that's what part of the vision, at least, was, even though the way it was presented was presented in a very, very bad and unconvincing way. So really, I'm just putting in a little plea for reinstatements of some railway lines that were closed, not all of those that were closed under beaching, but at least one or two of them, because they really do make sense in fixing the broken bits, especially the east-west parts of the connections.
Shall I respond directly, or is that?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Yeah. Thanks, James, and great to hear about your campaigning. This is partly in answer to David's question. I've met quite a lot of transport campaigners as a result of writing this book, and it's really interesting to hear what they're doing. And I sort of feel like I'm in the position of some kind of ecologically aware transport minister now, where I can give the green light to different projects or reject them, because and I'm not. I think so. I can't speak to that particular project. I completely agree with this idea of reopening being a slightly different case. So a lot of the carbon emissions and frankly human effort that goes into constructing railways is the sort of, you know, the tunnels and the bridges and stuff. And when you're reopening a railway line, some of those things already exist. So it's not the same as building a new one like HS2, and I completely agree with that. There are limits imposed, I think, by the climate emergency to how much you can even do that. I think. You have to focus, I think, on what good railways can do. I mean, they're not the solution to everything. And you have to think about not just the passenger considerations, but the freight too. And I think, you know, what they're really good at is moving large amounts of people at relatively low energy requirements quite quickly. So they're fantastic for urban travel, interurban travel, intercity travel, and moving large amounts of freight around. Whether those things pertain in the case of your reopening, I'm not sure. Maybe they do. So I'm not going to say no to that reopening. I'm just trying to put some principles in place. But the other thing that you mentioned about the roads is really important in this. I guess where I'm not quite sure this is where you were going, but it's one of the arguments for HS2, for example, is that we need a new railway line because of all the people flying from London to Scotland or something like that. And I can see by a reaction you can see where I'm going with this, but you know, the point is ban the flights. That's the first thing to do. Instantly, you've solved the problem of the flights. Yes, then you're going to need some more capacity on the railways, but that is possible to get fairly easily, I think, from the passenger numbers. But also the roads too. I mean, this is an infrastructure which already exists. We've already paid the carbon price for creating it. And I think there's a lot more potential for electrifying that. As Andrea indicated, this repurposing of the space that you've already taken to. So if you've got a dual carriageway, can one of the lanes be just for electric buses or even electric freight vehicles? And can we have a cycle lane there, please? And this sort of thing. And the other point, of course, is time. The climate emergency, most of the decarbonisation has to happen in the next 10 years. What can we do in 10 years? We can't build railway lines. We can maybe build a couple, but you know, that are ready to go type thing. Realistically, at the moment, railway lines take 20 or 30 years to build. Some of these questions about should we build another railway line from here to there? It's sort of, well, we can talk about that if you want. I'm not saying this to you, but to an imaginary person. I need to talk about the climate emergency, because if we don't deal with that, there's no point having a conversation. If we do manage to do that, which, you know, and deal with a lot of the problems, could we then in the future think about sort of building stuff like railways, and could we find ways to do that which don't harm the planet? That's possible, I think, but it's not something that's a solution to the problems that we have now. You know, jet zero or new types of construction material that aren't concrete and that kind of thing. These maybe, yeah. I mean, we've achieved a lot as a human race in a short amount of time in terms of technology, but they don't help us now. So I'm like I said to Andrea, really, I'm just posing these as things to think about. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we're getting towards the end of our time. If do you want to say any final comment, Andrea? No, I think we've.
No, thanks. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah. No, thanks for your comments, and thanks, Tom, for spending the time to, well, first write the book for us to have a chance to see it and then read it, and then to come and join us so we can discuss it with you. I'll put the recording on the website. I'll aim to do it within the next few days, so hopefully we can circulate it then.
Can I just say, David, sorry, I've put my email address up there for people watching the recording or here, if they want a signed copy of the book for a discounted price of £8, and send me an email and I can get that to you. Perfect. I would say, yeah. I've got mine here though, so I can't have a signed. Yes, next time I see you, yeah. But I really appreciate you putting this together, and thank you for taking the time to read it and comment on it. And not at all. Thanks very much. Thank you.